Welcome to the Pro Wrestling Exuberant. I'm Russell Franklin. On this episode, I'm going to talk about the evolution of what I call cool heels with a focus on the legendary Rowdy Roddy Piper. I'm going to share stories from meeting and interviewing wrestlers for magazines in the early 90s, including an encounter with a relatively unknown new talent named Lionheart Chris Jericho. I have part 2 of my AEW Territory Developmental League draft. Last episode, I highlighted 10 wrestlers that I firmly believe will be the top stars of the very new future on US television. They were all from the independent wrestling scene, and it included the wrestler I would make champion of this new promotion, Ricky Knight Jr. This episode, I'm going to showcase 5 more wrestlers I want for this promotion. It's going to be talent currently in AEW, but not in active storylines or getting significant airtime, and 5 wrestlers I believe deserve more. For wrestling merchandise, I'm going to discuss my collection of Japanese wrestling figures as well as a vintage Pro Wrestling USA program from the mid-80s. So let's get started. Heels are the bad guys in wrestling, the rule breakers. We're supposed to boo them if they're really good, and well, if they're especially good, especially back in the 80s, we're supposed to even hate them for the behavior. Or at least the promoters want us to, right? And one of the primary things that has always made it exciting for me in wrestling is good conflict, or in fan lingo, a feud. And there's got to be a reason behind the feud happening. It just can't be two people put together and I don't like you and this and that. It needs to have a reason and it needs to be developed and it needs to be a storyline. Sure, I can appreciate a good match. And I'd say in the last 10 years, I've grown to appreciate that even more when you see really amazing talent working together. It's something special. But it means more to me, though, if there's a grudge factor involved between the two people wrestling each other. Now remember, we're supposed to always boo the heel and boo them loudly. That's Wrestling 101. The promoter presents the wrestler in a way that is clear that we as fans should boo them. It was like this in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and on, even before the 80s. It's not subtle either in the traditional wrestling playbook. It's obvious who the bad guy is. And sometimes, a lot of the time for me, we like the heel. No matter how rude he is, or how much he cheats, or how obnoxious the behavior is he displays, we like him. He's kind of entertaining. He's funny. He's kind of cool. Think about 2 of the most popular modern wrestlers right now, in my opinion, in terms of the genuine passion the fans exhibit for them, the loudness of the sound they get when they just walk down that aisle, when they talk, just their whole presence. The 2 people I'm referring to are MJF and Swerve Strickland in AEW. And before they were wildly popular with these wildly popular reactions, both guys major heels. MJF, arrogant, he cheated, he just acted like an all-around jerk. But he did it masterfully. And yet people gradually started to cheer him. Despite how obnoxious he was, you couldn't help but like him. Why? Because he was entertaining. We like colorful personalities. He said he was a generational talent. And he truly was. And he truly is. Swerve Strickland, nasty guy, cocky, win at all costs attitude. Just this mean kind of deposition about him. But the guy could wrestle. He was confident. He projected confidence. And fans started cheering him. Thinking about these 2 modern superstars, MJF and Swerve Strickland, made me think about the first cool heel I ever saw as a fan, and that was Rowdy Roddy Piper. Now, Roddy Piper was first brought into the WWF as a manager, believe it or not. That was the idea they had for him, and I didn't realize that until very recently when I was looking up some information about him, that when he was brought in there in late 1983, despite being a very big star in the early 80s, in the Georgia territory, in the Mid-Atlantic territory, going back a little further than that in Portland in the late 70s. He was brought in there to be a manager for Dr. G. David Schultz. Didn't last long because by early 1984, they had him wrestling, and shortly after that, there was Piper's Pit. But the initial idea when he was brought in, they didn't see him as a wrestler. Now, Piper's Pit was a landmark interview segment. It was a talking that got him over, in my opinion, at the beginning. I'm not saying he didn't have exciting matches, good feuds, but it was really the talking of Roddy Piper that separated him, and I believe it was what made him different in that era, and is his legacy. It was the wit, it was the timing, it was just the way he delivered the lines. And he delivered a lot of iconic moments, a lot of them on this Piper's Pit show. There's Jimmy Snuka when he smashed the coconut over Jimmy Snuka's head, when he mocked the preliminary wrestler, the jobber Frankie Williams, and then just started beating him up. When he shaved the Haiti kid's hair. I mean, Roddy Piper was a jerk, a total jerk, and it was in the way he talked. It was in his mannerisms. It was in his actions too. And when I see MJF, I see a lot of comparisons to Roddy Piper. I see a lot of Roddy Piper in him. Now, Roddy Piper and MJF had a similarity in that they are both able to bring you in to the storyline, bring you in emotionally to what it is they're trying to get across by their mannerisms. And it's not always by the word, the verbal word, right? Sometimes it's by the facial expressions, and that's a pretty unique skill to have. Piper's peak as a heel was in the spring of '85. I absolutely hated him as a fan initially. Like in the first year I was watching wrestling, I just couldn't stand the guy. He was getting the reaction from me that the WWF wanted people to get. They wanted you to hate him. But he would speak his mind whenever he talked, and there was kind of a no nonsense approach to him, a cocky confidence, right? Kind of like MJF, kind of like Swerve Strickland. And Piper was funny. He was funny. You'd laugh at some of the stuff that he said. You could help it. MJF, same thing. You weren't supposed to like this guy, and you just couldn't help but like MJF because some of what he said is funny. Now, Roddy Piper had a pivotal role in the WWF explosion in '85. In my opinion, just as important and responsible for the wrestling boom in the mid '80s as Hulk Hogan. The Rock and Wrestling connection was huge in the mid '80s, a big deal, and it's very important in the context of wrestling history and in the surge of popularity of, we'll call it the WWF in the mid '80s, and arguably pro wrestling itself. There was definitely a trickle down effect during the mid '80s boom of putting eyes on wrestling in general. Now, you could say a lot of territories went under at this time, a lot of these other promotions didn't survive, but it created wrestling fans and people like myself who started watching WWF, got into other products. It created a whole trickle down effect. What was the Rock and Wrestling connection? It was a mixing of two worlds, wrestling and music, and it was masterful marketing to boost wrestling. Masterful marketing. It latched onto the popularity of an icon from that era, Cyndi Lauper. We know the name. Many of us, including myself, can't name another song she had beside Girls Wanna Have Fun. But she was a major icon from that period of time. The Rock and Wrestling connection initially started, the roots of it, in 1983 when Captain Lou Albano, a WWF manager and former wrestler, played Cyndi Lauper's father in the Girls Just Want to Have video. In early 1985, Cyndi Lauper was at Madison Square Garden for an awards presentation. She gave Lou Albano a gold and platinum record for his work with the MS Foundation. Cyndi Lauper got an achievement for participating with the WWF. Gorilla Monsoon referred to it as her contribution to the world of pro wrestling, which at the time I think was kind of laughable, but it really was true when you think of how impactful this whole angle was in the history of wrestling and in making wrestling really popular by exposing it to a lot of people. So while this is going on at Madison Square Garden during this little angle, when she's giving Lou Albano this record, Roddy Piper interrupts, and it's masterful the way he does it. He just kind of walks out there. He's just in his wrestling tights. He's not in a robe. It's just very matter of fact. He barely speaks. He kind of just says a few words that he wants to look at the record, and it's not really clear why he's out there. He takes the record and just boom, smashes it over Lou Albano's head. Cyndi Lauper tries to cover up on Lou Albano, like to protect him, and Piper, like pie face, kind of kicks her. And then he grabs her music manager, David Wolf, and he puts him in this kind of running power slam and just hurls him. I mean, the announcers called it a pile driver, but it just looked like him just throwing him across the ring. All this stuff looked real. It looked very spontaneous the way they executed it. It looked very, very good when I went back and watched it. It was such a heelish thing to do. So basic, but so heelish. Attack the manager, destroy his award, attack the celebrities. Hulk Hogan comes in, runs Piper off. And this was all a setup for a MTV special that year called War to Settle the Score. It aired on February 18th, 1985. It was a one-match show, a live match for the WWF title with Hulk Hogan defending against Rowdy Roddy Piper. And this idea was that this would set up WrestleMania 1. So Hulk Hogan wins the match by disqualification. Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Cowboy Bob Orton get involved. They attack Hogan. Mr. T, who is a very popular TV actor, had a show called A-Team at the time. He was in one of the Rocky movies as well a few years prior to this. He comes in to help Hulk Hogan. Them having this on MTV was huge. MTV was a fairly new medium in a couple years that had been around, but very, very popular, exposed pro wrestling to a whole new audience, made it look cool, and this was a key marketing point for WrestleMania 1, in my opinion, in making it a success, was this event they had before. So, of course, WrestleMania 1, the main event, Piper and Orndorff versus Hogan and Mr. T. Hogan and Mr. T get the win. And as they say, the rest is history. I mean, it just set WWF off and running. It was such a huge deal at the time, this event. I mean, it was people that weren't wrestling fans even talking about it. But by August of 86, Piper had left WWF. The rumor was he was retiring. He was going to try to become a movie star. He ended up coming back a year or so later. They made him a good guy. The way they did it was pretty straightforward and basic. I mean, people were already kind of liked him because he was so entertaining, even though he was supposed to be this big heel. And Piper's Pit had been replaced by a show called The Flower Shop, hosted by adorable Adrian Adonis. Adrian Adonis had Cowboy Bob Orton now as his bodyguard. So he was previously, like I mentioned a little before, it was with Piper. But it was the same Piper that kind of came out and destroyed the flower shop. It wasn't like, hey, I'm a good guy, or hey, I'm redeeming my attitude. No, he just came out there and had a bat, didn't say much, and just repped the place. And it was the same guy. He was just now turning his attention to someone that we really didn't like. And you think about MJF when he's like, I'm your scumbag, he's the same MJF in a lot of ways, you know? There's so many parallels in mannerism and speech and presentation between Roddy Piper and MJF. Whether MJF had studied Roddy Piper and some of his work and incorporates that, or it's just natural. But I just see so many parallels in them, like I said, in mannerisms and speech, as someone that watched Roddy Piper in his prime and now watching MJF, and he's in his prime, but I'm almost like there's more and more to come. He's just kind of peeking right in there. In the mid 80s, at the time Piper was wrestling's #1 heel, you could go into a newsstand magazine store, and newsstand magazine stores really don't even exist anymore. I mean, yeah, you could see a bunch of magazines at a regular bookstore. I mean, some of them are special issues, but I'm talking about when there was like a rack full of actual monthly magazines. So when you would go into a newsstand magazine store, you would find dozens of pro wrestling magazines there in the mid 80s, and they would come out usually on a monthly basis with new issues. And this is in the pre-internet, obviously pre-streaming area. And the way to learn about the top promotions of the time, like WWF, NWA, and AWA, and the top wrestlers in each of these promotions, was by reading the magazines. Wrestling magazines also showcase many of the regional promotions and stars that fans might not have access to on television based on where they lived. There was the CWA, the Continental Wrestling Association, based out of Tennessee, often just referred to as Memphis Wrestling. Jerry the King Lawler was heavily featured in magazines, and he was the promotion's top star. Mid-South Wrestling, run by Bill Watts, was also featured heavily in magazines, with stars like Ted DiBiase and Jim Duggan, both of whom would end up in WWF very soon. In 1986, Mid-South Wrestling would rebrand to the UWF, and they'd attempt to become a national promotion and rival to the WWF, the NWA, and the AWA. They only lasted about a year before they were bought by the NWA and absorbed into the promotion. The UWF name and its title were quickly phased out. So by the early 90s, the overall popularity of wrestling from a few years earlier, from that period of Piper's peak, it seemed to be waning steadily in the US. Within a few years, the wrestling landscape would be largely dominated by the WWF and WCW, seen as its only and somewhat distant rival. I mean, the NWA was rebranded to WCW when Jim Crockett sold the promotion to Ted Turner in 1988. So I started writing for wrestling magazines in the late 80s when they were still thriving, and it gave me the opportunity to interview a lot of wrestlers about their careers. However, I'd say in about a period of about 18 months in the early 90s, close to a dozen newsstand wrestling magazines ceased operation in rapid succession, and the state of pro wrestling magazines would never recover, as the amount of magazines in general would be reduced. I mean, regardless of the genre, substantially in the decades to follow. I mean, print media was largely replaced by digital products, right? There's just not a lot of print media anymore. As of 2024, Pro Wrestling Illustrated is the sole United States based print pro wrestling magazine, believe with 9 issues a year. Even WWE ceased production of its print magazine in 2014. So, I mean, magazines in general are one of those things I think have become kind of, in a way, obsolete. And there were a lot of wrestling magazine articles I wrote in the early 90s that never got published. I had several interview based stories prepared to be published in a magazine for which I wrote most of the content, when the publishing company abruptly went out of business just weeks before an issue containing all of them were supposed to be printed and released. One of the articles for that never released issue featured a wrestler from Canada who was just starting out and had very little exposure in the US. This was going to be the first article on him in a US pro wrestling magazine. The wrestler's name was Lionheart Chris Jericho. I searched in vain recently for the original tape recording from the interview I did with Chris Jericho, and I found almost every recorded interview I ever did, which amazed me. And these things go back to the late 80s, early 90s, except one I couldn't find. And that was the interview with Chris Jericho. I had wanted to include the transcript of the interview. I had wanted to talk about the actual questions I had asked him back then, perhaps even put a clip of it on here, but no, I cannot find that tape. I was introduced to Chris by an independent wrestler and occasional WWE ring announcer at live events named Bill Anderson. I used to correspond with him by letter pretty frequently. Again, this is long, long before emails existed. Bill would send me memorabilia from whenever he toured Japan for the FMW promotion, where he wrestled under a mask as part of a tag team called the Mercenaries. And in wrestling, I think Bill is perhaps best known by fans who possess an encyclopedic knowledge of professional wrestling as having been the in-ring trainer at Red Bastien School for a class that included Sting and the Ultimate Warrior. Bill actually sent me the group photo once for a story I was doing about the wrestling class with Sting and Ultimate Warrior, and it also featured the Angel of Death, who had a good run in world-class championship wrestling in UWF, and Steve DeSalvo, a wrestler with a great, great look, who had some success in Canada, but never hit his stride on the national circuit in the US. After one of his tours in Japan, Bill called me and told me he had met this young wrestler from Canada who was very talented, a really nice, respectful guy who was eager to advance in the business. Bill said he trained at Stu Hart's wrestling school in Calgary, and I believe one of the Hart brothers was training the students by this time. And Bill thought the young wrestler, his name was Lionheart Chris Jericho, was someone I should consider writing a story about. So I told Bill to, pass my number along to him. A few days later, I get a phone call, and the person on the line just goes, "Hi, I'm Chris Jericho." We chatted briefly, and since I had never seen him wrestle, didn't even know what he looked like, I asked if he had any footage he could send me showing him wrestle to help me write a better story. and I agreed to do a telephone interview with him after I received and viewed his tape. Shortly thereafter, I received a videotape in the mail, and it contained like a professionally edited highlight reel. I remember it was set to a Metallica song, and it also contained two full-length matches. And one of those matches I remember took place in Mexico with future WCW talent Norman Smiley. And needless to say, watching the video, I was very impressed. Chris had a good look, long blonde hair, muscular physique, impressive high-flying moves, and most importantly, he could wrestle really well. And the tape showcased his diverse style, and it was the most professional, put together promo tape that I had ever received. And I received a lot of them from different wrestlers. I don't remember much about the interview, unfortunately. That's why I was hoping to find the tape to kind of hear what kind of questions I asked him. But a few months after the article would have appeared on newsstands, Chris debuted in WCW, and his career skyrocketed from there. He went on to, become one of the most successful and popular wrestlers of all time. One more twist about that lost VHS tape on which Chris wrote Lionheart on the label. The time I interviewed him, I was living in a college dorm, and one day someone on the same floor walked in the room and tossed me the VHS promo tape and wanted to know, well, what's this garbage? What is this? He was annoyed because he quote unquote borrowed the tape, right? He borrowed it, thinking it was a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie from the time period called Lionheart. Does anybody remember that movie? I was a big Jean-Claude Van Damme fan. I loved action movies back in the 80s. And so this guy had just basically taken his tape and then was annoyed to find out as he saw just some pro wrestling video. What is this? So another unpublished story was on NWA star Bobby Fulton. And I'm gonna call this story the promoter is some guy named Bobby Fulton. So I was traveling through a small town when I saw a flyer advertising a wrestling show at the local high school in town. And I was really surprised to see some really big names on the flyer. It advertised matches with Buddy Landell, Junkyard Dog, Tommy Rich, and I wasn't used to independent shows featuring any name talent at that time. So I called the number on the poster to get in touch with the promoter about taking photos ringside, doing some interviews for magazine articles. The number I called was actually like the office of the athletic director of the high school, and he couldn't help me, but he said he'd give me the phone number of the promoter. And I remember this very well. He goes, the promoter is some guy named Bobby Fulton. And it was just a matter of fact. I'm just like, Bobby Fulton? I'm like, Bobby Fulton's a huge name in wrestling. He was part of the Fantastics tag team. They were one of the top tag teams in wrestling throughout the mid to late 80s. Kind of like, how do you not know who Bobby Fulton is? Kind of like lecturing him in my excitement. I mean, he couldn't have cared less. I mean, for me, it was just a few years earlier as a fan. I was sitting at my local arena in sold out NWA shows, watching the Fantastics and watching them on cable TV every week. So I thought this was really cool that this guy was a promoter. And the Fantastics had successful runs everywhere they went, including a high profile feud with the Midnight Express in the NWA in the, I believe, late 80s. So it turned out Bobby grew up in the area where this match was being held. He had recently moved back to his hometown, which was a small town right over from where I was. So we did a long interview the night of the show. He went into great detail about his career. The story was going to be published in the same magazine that the Chris Jericho story was going to be in, but as I mentioned, the story went under. I talked to Bobby on the phone several times after that initial interview, and we would just talk about wrestling in general. And I enjoyed talking to him a lot. He was just a very genuinely friendly guy. And I did something I had never done before that I'd never done since. I made him a VHS tape full of a bunch of matches that I had recorded off TV that was him in NWA and UWF. Because I used to record lots of different shows right off the television. I just liked having copies of it, so I would record. I had world class shows on recorded. I had AWA, I had NWA, I had WWF, and I still have these tapes. I just don't have a VHS, unfortunately, to go back and watch it. Maybe I will be able to find a used one day. But I remember how appreciative he was when I sent it to him. I remember some of the stuff on there was the Fantastics and Sheepherders. Always liked heels, and two of my favorites were Ivan and Nikita Koloff from the 80s in the NWA. Now, we were supposed to boo them because they were Russian, but I like these guys. They came across as tough and determined, focused to win athletes. Ivan had the pedigree of being WWF champion in the early 70s. It was very unusual to be WWF champion. There hadn't been many of them. Nikita had the muscle and power. In reality, they weren't Russian at all. I believe Ivan was French Canadian. Nikita was American. He was from Minnesota. I got the opportunity to interview Ivan Koloff in 1991 for a magazine article, and he was only a few years removed from that highly successful run on NWA television, where he was known as Uncle Ivan, manager, mentor, and sometimes tag team partner of rising star Nikita Koloff. And these guys played the role of evil Russians, and this was during the height of the Cold War between the USA and USSR in the mid 80s, and even movies from that era, whenever, action movies, whenever there was a bad guy, they were always Russians. Like I mentioned, in reality, they weren't Russian at all, Ivan and Nikita Koloff. Ivan was also very well known for being WWF champion. In fact, he was the third ever, or at that time when he had the belt, it was called WWWF champion. So he was the third champion ever in the whole lineage of this. When you look at the true lineal history of the title, and there is footage that exists, and I have some DVDs from the mid 2000s where they put this match on there of Ivan's historic win over Bruno Sammartino. I interviewed Ivan. It was a small, very, very small independent show where there couldn't have been more than like 100 people in attendance. And at the time, the concept of independent shows itself, it was largely new. Territory promotions were only, 5 years kind of from disappearing. And especially the concept of an independent show of a former TV star and a roster of unknowns in a small setting was new and innovative. Within a few years, by like the mid 90s, that was a standard way they would run these shows. Is you would have local wrestlers filling out the card, most of them with not too much experience, and then you would bring in a name person in the main event with the idea that would sell the tickets. And these type of shows, like the one Ivan was on in 1991, they were trying to fill the gap kind of left by the whole disappearance of territory promotions with a full-time roster, storylines, and television shows. These would just be kind of like one-off shows. I mean, some of these promotions, if you could call them that, only ran one or two shows and they were gone, and somebody else would come in and run one or two shows. But anyway, the promoter granted me access to the show, and I suspect probably because I said I'll mention his promotion in the article. And to Ivan's credit, I remember when I was introduced to him and explained that I wanted to interview him for the evening for an article, he immediately sat down with me. He was very generous in giving me his time, although it was pretty clear to me, the promoter didn't tell him beforehand someone was coming to talk to him, but he was very, very cordial. And that's how I met the legendary Russian Bear Ivan Koloff. I can still remember the setting well. It was a dilapidated back room of a very rundown, tiny community activities hall. And these small town events were a long, long way from the stadium shows that Ivan performed in at the height of his NWA tenure when he headlined at Madison Square Garden for the WWWF in the 70s. And like I mentioned, at the time it was relatively unknown for a top name to work these local shows, but that would soon become the standard pattern in the years to come when these guys would leave WWF. That's what they would do. They would headline these shows around the country. I'm going to go ahead and read you the Ivan Koloff story that I wrote in the early 90s for a magazine. Ivan Koloff catching up with a former WWF champion. Very few wrestlers can claim to have held a World Heavyweight Championship, let alone the World Championship of the most recognized promotion in the world, the WWF. On January 18, 1971, at Madison Square Garden, Ivan Koloff permanently wrote his name in the wrestling history books. It was on this winter night in New York that the Russian Bear defeated Bruno Sammartino. No one thought that Bruno could be beaten. The Italian strongman had held a vice-like grip on the championship for nearly 8 years since he defeated the first ever WWF champion Buddy Rogers. Now, Rogers won, quote-unquote, won the title in a tournament that took place in Brazil, according to the promotion, right? Simply put, the WWF, they anointed Rogers as champion and declared that he won the title in a tournament that just happened to take place on another continent, right? So Rogers dropped the title to Sammartino within a few months of that in a match that lasted under 30 seconds. It ended with Rogers submitting to a bear hug. Wrestling lore has it that Rogers was suffering from some kind of heart ailment, and the promotion brass needed to move the title from him as soon as possible for medical reasons, but who knows what the real story was. Okay, back to the article. Koloff only held the World Championship for a month before losing it to Pedro Morales. But by then, his name reached the legendary status that still exists over 20 years later. Throughout the 70s, Ivan was one of the most persistent and toughest challengers for the WWF title. He nearly defeated Morales, Sammartino, and Bob Backlund for the title on various occasions before the decade was over. So what follows next is Ivan's account of how he became a professional wrestler. From a very young age, Koloff had an interest in professional wrestling. Ivan's great uncle, Dan Koloff, was a famous wrestler during the 30s and 40s. Ivan may have taken the name Koloff from him, as many wrestlers would adopt other wrestlers' names from earlier eras, but I'm unclear if they were actually related in real life. Since the time when you would do interviews with wrestlers, they were in character when we would do these interviews for magazines. They weren't like behind the scenes kind of interviews. It would have been like inappropriate for me and against wrestling protocol for me to question him and be like, "Oh, is that your actual uncle?" Here we go with the story again. Young Ivan dreamed of following in his great uncle's footsteps. Ivan started wrestling as a professional in 1965. He debuted first in Asia and later came to wrestle in Montreal. During the course of his career, Koloff wrestled for all the major promotions in the United States and for many of the top organizations in Japan. I enjoyed wrestling in Japan for different promotions because the wrestlers are so competitive and the business of wrestling is handled seriously. The fans enjoy the sport greatly and are very supportive of it, said Koloff. Because of his reign as WWF champion, Ivan considers the WWF to be his favorite promotion for which he worked. Koloff was still touring with the national promotions until recently. In WCW, he was very successful as the tag team partner and manager of his nephew, Nikita Koloff, during the mid-80s. Over the last few years, Ivan said he has avoided working full-time for organizations like WCW. His preference for working an independent circuit, which did then and still does mean working almost exclusively weekends, is typical of many of today's big stars like Brian Blair and the Honky Tonk Man, both of whom choose not to work for the major promotions anymore. The best thing about working on the independent scene is that I have control over my time, commented Ivan. Nowadays I pick and choose my schedule so it is convenient for me. As opposed to wrestling 7 days a week, I can wrestle where and when I want. Right now I'm working twice a week. After so many years on the road, I still keep my schedule down. Despite the reduced schedule, Koloff is still keeping quite active around the country. His travels with independent organizations have taken him all over the United States, including Texas, Ohio, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Maryland. He has made frequent appearances overseas, including tours in Kuwait and Bermuda. Having a legendary wrestler like Ivan on shows always helps promotions draw fans because they are anxious to see the former champ in action. Koloff has not disappointed them. He has not lost a step over the years in the ring. In recent years, he has been facing well-known talents like Brian Blair, Bobby Fulton, Wahoo McDaniel, and Paul Orndorff. In addition to facing big-name talent, Koloff can also be found testing his skills against the young up-and-coming wrestlers on the smaller circuits. At a recent show in Pasadena, Maryland, Koloff was booked to face the local promotion's top heavyweight champion. In addition to facing big-name talent, Koloff can also be found testing his skills against the young up-and-coming wrestlers on the smaller circuits. At a recent Mid-Eastern Wrestling Federation show in Pasadena, Maryland, Koloff was booked to face the promotion's top heavyweight, the Golden Phoenix. The bout between Koloff and the Phoenix proved to be a very interesting one. It was a match of wily veteran Ivan versus upstart the Phoenix. Ivan, with his nearly 30 years of experience and knowledge, was matched against a burly, rising young star hungry for fame. Koloff came accompanied to the ring by the Russian Assassin, a MEWF wrestler. Now, it seems whenever an independent promoter needed someone to don the mask, usually a wrestler who had already appeared on the show, and back then, he was always called the Assassin for some reason. It was kind of a generic name they always use. And wrestlers, while Koloff distracted the referee, Ivan used his chain to work over the Golden Phoenix. The Phoenix refused to back down from anything the veteran Koloff dished out. Koloff, in turn, matched the much younger wrestler in all encounters. The match finally came to an end when the Russian Assassin entered the ring and caused Koloff to be disqualified. The Russian Assassin and Koloff delivered a brutal beating to the Golden Phoenix. Ivan was out to prove that he was still tough as nails and a man not to be messed with. Later that week, Koloff met another upstart young wrestler, Tony Stetson, in Philadelphia for the debut show of Eastern Wrestling Federation. Ivan may have been mistaken on the name of that promotion, as he was likely referring to Eastern Championship Wrestling, which a few years later kind of is the lineage of morphing into ECW Extreme Championship Wrestling, of course. Back with the story. Once again, Ivan brutally beat his opponent with his infamous chain after the match. The spring of 1982 saw Koloff spending some time in Japan wrestling for a new organization called Wings with one of his nephews that he trained, Vladimir. Chances are good when you can't find Koloff in the ring wrestling, he will be in North Carolina training wrestling hopefuls at one of two schools. In order to help ensure a steady flow of new faces in the mat game, Koloff has been running his own wrestling school in Indian Trails, North Carolina, near Charlotte. The school currently has approximately 40 students and runs classes every weekend. Former WCW wrestlers David Isley and Rick Nelson assist Ivan in the training of students. Anybody interested in pursuing a career in wrestling, man or woman, I believe I can help you, said Koloff. Whether you're interested in becoming a wrestler, referee, or manager, my program can help you. I have an in-depth course for wrestlers that covers basic holds, counters, ring psychology, and interviews. When you can become a student of mine, I am your coach and will help you develop a career. Ivan also trains wrestlers twice a week at the South Atlantic Pro Wrestling School for the local promoter. Kolf says there is a lot of potential among the current group that he is training at the school. There are 10 students that should be making names for themselves in the wrestling world very soon, he mentioned. WCW's Chip the Firebreaker and WWF's Tatanka received advice and fine-tuned their skills at Ivan's school before going to the big time. The Russian Bear, Ivan Koloff, has some stern advice for prospective wrestlers. Stay away from steroids, said the former world champion. I am strictly against young athletes taking steroids. More and more side effects are being discovered each year. There are a couple of friends of mine who used steroids in the past and are regretting it now. For a person to be only 40 or 50 years old and crippled because of steroids after a successful career is a real shame. Now, steroids have been legal with a doctor's prescription a couple of years before this interview took place and were a very hot topic in the news at the time I had spoke to Ivan. Koloff further warns wrestling fans to avoid all drugs, including cocaine, alcohol, downers, uppers, and other similar substances. The computer can't function right if different chemicals are in it, said the Russian Bear in a gruff voice, relating to the effects of illicit drugs on the human body. Koloff has been around professional wrestling for 4 decades and he has accomplished a lot. When Koloff finally does retire from wrestling, he will not soon be forgotten. He was one of the first Russian villains to appear and make it big on the US scene many years ago. Ivan's many students will carry on the wrestling style he taught them long after he is gone from the sport. So here we go with part 2 of my new territory style developmental league that I'm the promoter and booker of, that Tony Khan put me in charge of. It's funded by the AEW. It's a feeder promotion of sorts. It's going to showcase talent I believe in with the idea that how I present them will earn them a substantial push and storyline focus in AEW. And as booker, I'm going to develop the storylines. I have the final say on finishes. Basically, complete creative control. To reiterate from last episode, this new league is going to run on local TV. It's local venues in a tri-state area. The idea is to get these wrestlers in this promotion as much ring time as possible, as much mic time. I want AEW / Tony Khan to see them for what I see them as top of the line talents that deserve a big push on the AEW roster. And when the time is right, they'll be slotted in there and a storyline will be developed around them at the beginning and bring them in with momentum. So that's the idea behind this. And for this promotion, AEW has authorized me to do the hirings at my full discretion. And this time around, for the second round of this, I'm going to bring in 5 AEW wrestlers that aren't being used very much on TV. They haven't been in focused storylines, and I'm going to bring them in here and really flesh out the presentation of them because I think they're great talents and they have a tremendous amount of potential when presented in a certain way to be top of the line. So here are my 5 picks in no particular order. I think highly of all 5 of these guys. Number 1, Griff Garrison. In a different era, I think this guy would have been a major star very quickly. I was very surprised to learn he's been wrestling since 2016 when I looked up some information on him. So he's been around and he should be a major star now. He looks great. He just looks like a star. He works good in the ring. I mean, I suspect based on the matches I saw where he was paired with Cole Carter a little while back and Maria Kanellis was her manager in Ring of Honor, I think Griff Garrison's got a lot of natural heel potential. And I think there's a lot of personality there just waiting to come out. Back when he was in the Varsity Blondes and they were doing that angle with the Disciple angle, House of Black and where Julia Hart ended up leaving and the Varsity Blondes, and joined House of Black. I very badly wanted to see Griff Garrison made into one of the Disciples as well. I thought it would have been a major boost for him, something he badly needed at the time. And I think for Griff Garrison, someone just needs to get behind this guy and come up with some good storylines around him and give him a fair shot. And I believe the sky's the limit for him. For some reason, watching him, he reminds me in his mannerisms of Kevin Von Erich and also a little bit of Rick Rude, but he's all his own. He's all his own. I think given the chance, the fair form, I think this guy would do very well, and I think he would be a fantastic heel. Number 2, Kip Sabian. Now, Kip Sabian's been in AEW since the very beginning, and this is another guy, to me, that checks all the boxes. He looks good. He works good. We know he can talk. We've heard him talk before. He's a veteran. He's been around wrestling since 2010, so he's got a lot of experience to offer in that way, and even working with newer talent. And he's got a certain charisma about him you can't teach. And he's never really been in any substantial storylines. He had that one years ago with Miro when Miro first came in and Kip was going to get married and Miro's his best man. And they were funny together, I thought. I thought it showed Kip's comedic side and his versatility. And he's just never really had anything substantial in the showcase. And I think he needs it. He deserves it. Number 3, Nick Camarado. Now, I first started watching wrestling in the 80s, so I have to say I'm partial to the muscle guys. I just came from that era where it's like larger-than-life characters. And I believe these big, muscled guys are still an important, cool dimension to have in wrestling, mixing them in with the other talent. And he's shown he has personality when, in the limited time he's been presented. He's shown that when he was with QT, I believe, Marshall and that faction, he had personality. When they just anytime I've seen him, I see a personality is just not fleshed out. He's got a memorable look. I mean, he's probably one of the thickest guys in wrestling, like thickness of muscle wise. He just needs repackaging. I'm thinking like Razor Ramon vibes when I see this guy for some reason. And he's another veteran too. He's been around since 2013. Another one I was surprised he'd been wrestling for so long. He was in WWE actually in 2019 under contract to them, released in 2020. So he's got a lot of potential. He just needs again to be given the chance and given something substantial like a storyline around him. Number 4, Josh Woods. I'm getting Kurt Angle vibes from him every time I see him. Just the whole presentation I like. This another guy again checks all the boxes. An accomplished amateur. He looks legit tough. He just has a whole presentability about him when he comes out there. You take notice of him. And he was in WWE as well. Like I mentioned, Camarado was as well for a period. Woods, I didn't know this either, there from 2014 to 2016 under contract to them. I like him initially if I were to present him as a heel. It's kind of vicious. Perhaps, you could also do like a bodyguard type thing of him with a new face. But I see him being flipped eventually into a good guy / face type character. He overcomes the odds. There's a lot of options you can do with this guy as far as storylines, and I just haven't seen it in the way he's been presented. Number 5, Tony Nese. Another veteran, been wrestling since 2005. He's had substantial national level exposure in TNA and WWE prior to AEW. I think he has perhaps the best pure bodybuilding style physique in wrestling. He's actually an online fitness coach as well. So you can actually hire this guy to help you build muscle. I mean, how cool is that? But continue with the theme of the other 4 guys. I mean, he's just underutilized. He's charismatic. He's got the ring skills. I can see it all there. It's just not being let go. So that's my number 5 pick, Tony Nese. Next episode, I'm going to reveal 5 more picks from the AEW roster I'll be bringing into this promotion. So let's go through the new wrestling merchandise I have. First up, we have the Demolition Micro Brawlers from Pro Wrestling Tees. These were a limited release. They released about 500 of these.
We have Axe and Smash. They were packaged separately, but when you order them, it was ordered as a pack. The micro brawlers in general, I love them. I think they're fantastic. I'm always amazed with figures this size how they are able to get the faces looking so accurately. These two of Axe and Smash are no different. I mean, they really have the faces to me spot on. And there's a lot of demolition figures coming out right now, it seems like, from a lot of different companies. This is the first of the recent incarnation of releases that I've gotten of these two. I'm very pleased with them. They look very good. Next up, we have it's Mattel from the WWE Legends line. We have Jimmy Hart. This is actually the first Jimmy Hart figure I've ever gotten. I have a bobblehead of him, but not an actual figure. This is Jimmy Hart era of WCW when he first came in there and was managing Hogan. I like this Legends line a lot from Mattel. It might be one of my favorite ones they release. I think it's a Target exclusive, I believe. And their face looks great. They nailed the face. He's holding a red microphone that says Hulk. Looks like it says Hulk rules. I'm sorry, Hulk a phone. I just looked at it, turned it sideways. He's wearing this jacket, if you remember him from those early days in WCW. It's got a nice picture of Hulk Hogan, like airbrushed on the back. It says WCW. It's a very good figure, very nice figure. They just pat him with the sunglasses. I never like keeping the sunglasses on these figures for some reason. I always take them off, even though Jimmy Hart always wore the sunglasses. So I have him without the sunglasses, and again, impressive figure. Another figure from the same line that I got at the same time. This is a Hulk Hogan figure, but it's a little different than the other ones I have, and I've noticed they've been doing this a lot lately. Is with the WWE Legends ones, they're putting out different looks of Hogan pre WWF era of the mid 80s, and I think this is very cool. This figure, I believe he's wearing like a very large cape that's like silver on the outside, purple on the inside, all white gear. I believe this figure is from the early 80s look of him, and I have actually another one from a different line of Mattel I got recently that is actually from the late 70s. So I think it's very cool. They're starting to release different figures of Hogan. My favorite ones of Hogan are always from that 84, 85, 86, 87 era, the Hulkamania, the red shirt, yellow tights, but I think it's neat to have a bunch of different looks of him. Now I have more figures of Hulk Hogan than any other wrestler. I just recently counted them. I have 24 different figures of Hulk Hogan. The first one is from that 1985-ish LJN figure, right up to some recent ones of him, and I have all kinds of different looks of him. So I definitely am a Hulk Hogan figure collector. Pretty much if I see a Hulk Hogan figure, I'm going to get it. My two favorite Hulk Hogan figures I have, I would say, are the original, the LJN Hulk Hogan figure. The LJN line in general, I just really like a lot, that whole rubber figure look. I have a giant Hulk Hogan figure. I don't know what the line was. I just don't remember. It was a Jack specific release from like the mid 2000s. I like that one a lot. My other favorite Hulk Hogan figure I have is from Mattel Creations. It's modeled after the Hasbro figures of the 90s. It's that iconic look of the yellow tights, the red shirt. It came in a 4-pack. Also in that pack was Big John Studd, Wendy Richter, and Muhammad Ali. The other new wrestling stuff that I have is I just got the new issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated in the mail. I'm a subscriber to this. I've probably been subscribing to it for 2 years. I originally subscribed to the magazine back in the 80s. I fell off at some point in the 90s. I think I stopped buying them. But back when I originally first started reading it, there was Pro Wrestling Illustrated. They had a sister publication called The Wrestler, and then another one called Inside Wrestling. And I subscribed to all three of those. And then they had a bunch of other different magazines that I think came out periodically, maybe bi-monthly, quarterly, and I had all those. But I just got back into it again a couple years ago. They changed editors. I picked up to see what the new magazine looked like, and I really like the writing in it. I like the columns. They cover a lot of different leagues. If you're not familiar with it, or you were a reader a long time ago and stopped reading it for a while like I did, give it a shot. They sell it at bookstores, big chain bookstores. You can usually find it, but it's definitely worth getting a subscription. I like getting it in the mail, that whole experience. And I like magazines in general, and it's just a dying thing. It's hard to find magazines that are on the topics you like, whatever the genre. that are original content and aren't like packaged compilation type publications. So let's go through what they have in this issue. This is the October 2024 issue. On the cover, they have Roxanne Perez. It says, "New attitude for a new era. Roxanne Perez, I'm going to take over." NXT's prodigy worn stars of Raw and SmackDown. They also have tags on here to exclusive Crockett Cup photos. The Idol Killer, Tekla's cold-blooded plot to rule stardom, and Bet Your Bottom Dollar on the resilient AJ Francis. And those are a couple of the tags they have on the cover. So like I said, I like how they cover a lot of different leagues all over the world. I think it's pretty cool. The writing in here is very good. We look through a little more of the actual content in here. There's some talk about Double or Nothing 2024 and who they think are the winners and losers of that event. Wrestling's new royal couple, Michael Oku and Amira Blair, the British wrestling duo making headlines and turning heads across the globe. I've talked about Michael Oku in other episodes. This is the next big star to come out of the UK. He currently, I believe, is a Rev Pro British heavyweight champion. I don't know how he's not signed like by AEW or WWE at this point, but that's a name to keep in your mind. They got a bunch of different columns in here, and it's just a real comprehensive magazine. I encourage you to check it out, see what you think. It's got good photography. It's just a nice publication with a mix of different stuff. It's about 82 pages long. Other new item I have is the Pro Wrestling Torch issue 1879, June 19th, 2024 edition. I'm also a subscriber to this. I talked about Pro Wrestling Torch the last episode. It is the last surviving print newsletter. I really enjoy getting this in the mail every week. I'll continue to subscribe to it. Another one, I encourage you to check it out, see if you like it. They do a lot of recaps of what happened on TV shows, mainly for WWE and AEW. I like the format. It gives you a breakdown of the match and a couple sentence analysis. Then there's usually like a column in here, but I'm going to go through the whole issue. It's not gossip news, kind of behind the scenes centric, but it's a very good read. In this issue, they have a report on the WWE Clash at the Castle. They have a report on the June 10th edition of WWE Raw. They have a report on the June 12th issue. They have a report on the June 12th episode of AEW Dynamite. They have another one on SmackDown from that same week. And that's kind of the format here. It just kind of gives you a quick overview. If you're having trouble keeping up on what's going on TV and keeping current and you don't mind knowing the results, this is a quick way to stay on top of the news, but then go back and watch the actual shows later. Every issue they have a column by Greg Parks. He talks on different topics. Sometimes it's analysis. Sometimes he reviews products. In this issue, he talks about Dave Pencer's new autobiography where he shares WCW memories. I actually just got that book recently. I haven't read it yet, but it's always an enjoyable column. And then the back of the issue is just different news items, usually related to ratings. The whole publication runs about, what do we have here? 13 pages, but it's a good read. I recommend it. The figures from my collection that I want to highlight today are not from an actual line, but I want to showcase all the different Japanese wrestling figures I have. And I actually didn't start watching Japanese wrestling till a few years ago, and I really enjoy it. The leagues that I follow are New Japan Pro Wrestling Noah, and Stardom. I probably would follow more, but it's just kind of a time constraint thing. But like I mentioned, for many years watching wrestling, I knew of Japanese wrestling, but I never sought it out or tried to find the content of it and watch it for whatever reason. I remember back, in the 90s, a lot of people would have VHS tapes and trading the tapes back and forth. And I remember someone did give me a VHS tape of Japanese wrestling. That was the only time I had actually watched it. I remember it had a few Americans on there. The only one I do remember is Sting being on the tape. I don't remember anything much else about it. I knew, of course, a lot of who the bigger names were. Antonio Inoki, Giant Baba, but not much about Japanese wrestling itself, except for being familiar with the few that I had seen on TV growing up, like Jushin Liger and Great Muta in NWA. Of course, I knew him from there, but I didn't know his whole history and his whole background. Right now, my favorite wrestler in Japan is Ken O, and I'd probably say he's, regardless of the league, one of my favorite wrestlers, period. Absolutely enjoy watching him wrestle. He has this intensity about him, this very serious aura. His matches are very physical, very enjoyable to watch him. I find it amazing that I'm able to connect so deeply with a wrestler that doesn't even speak my language, all through his facial expressions and body language. I like Nakajima a lot. I haven't seen him since he's moved over to All Japan, but I liked his Noah work tremendously. Both of these guys were part of a faction called Kongo for a while. The very first wrestling figure I ever got that was a Japanese wrestling figure was of Antonio Inoki. It looks very similar to the Hasbro type figures of the 90s. It's a solid figure. You know, he's got his black tights on. It's about the same dimensions. And I just bought this at a wrestling figure store. I saw it on the shelf. I knew who he was. Oh, that's different. That's cool. I'm going to get that. Then right after that, I ordered a figure years and years ago. This would have been mid 2000s, from eBay, from someone in Japan, of the Great Muta, because I knew, of course, who he was, watching him in NWA, his feud with Sting. And this figure is, again, very similar to a Hasbro type figure, maybe slightly larger, but same kind of consistency, solid. And then I didn't get any other Japanese figures for a very long time until I started watching Japanese wrestling, and I saw that Super 7 had two lines of New Japan figures out. I kind of came in late to the game when I heard about them. About 2023, I think, is when I started hearing about these, but they were actually 2021 releases. Quite hard to find. I'm not sure why they didn't do more lines of this, because maybe the license or whatever the reason was expired to be able to make figures from New Japan, but they're very popular, like I said, very hard to find, and can be quite pricey. And they have very elaborate packaging, the way they're done. The figures that I have is of a Hiroshi Tanahashi. I'm looking at that one right now. These are very nice design figures. They're similar looking to the Mattel ones, I'd say, in size, and I have them on my shelf grouped with the Mattel ones. He's wearing an IWGP title belt. He's got a very cool looking jacket on. He's got knee pads on to say High Fly, and it's got his name on the other pad. It's a very cool figure. The other one that I have from Series 1 is Tomohiro Ishii. That was actually the first one I could find that I got of him. He's wearing the Never Open belt. He's got a shirt on that says Chaos, which was a faction he was in. Stone Pitbull, his nickname. Face, spot on. Looks very good. Very nice figure. From Series 2, I have Evil. That was the one that was probably, if you're going looking for these for some reason, is the easiest to find. They actually have one of Will Ospreay, and even a couple years ago, that figure was very expensive to get if you didn't get it as a new release, and is now very hard to find. So he's got like this big robe, black robe on him, and a lot of gear. I wanted to kind of take the outfit off, but the way they have it stitched on, it's kind of hard to get off. But yeah, again, another one with a very good face, like all other three. And the other one I got from Series 2 is Hiromu Takahashi, wearing a white jacket, colored tights. Very good figure. I like these a lot. They're not going to be more of them, but they're cool figures. I went looking after getting these at what other Japanese kind of import figures I could find online, and I came across Softbee Japanese imports, and it's not really a line. I had trouble finding out too much about the company, but they put out a bunch of these figures on different people from different promotions in Japan. They're soft vinyl figures. They're on the smaller side. They're probably, I'm holding them up like against the Inoki one, which is a Hasbro. The Inoki one that is like Hasbro style, and it's slightly larger than the Softbee one, but the Softbee ones are much thicker. And these are some of my favorite figures, period. I really like how they're designed. The first one I got was a soft vinyl of Minoru Suzuki, and it said on the box the figure had been sculpted by athlete figure sculpting legend. I'm reading this here, HAO, I guess it's just three initials. And the creation of the figure was supervised by Minoru Suzuki himself. So he's wearing white tights. He's got his towel. He's got that kind of sinister grin on his face. It's a very cool figure. I went looking for more of these, and they're hard to find and they're expensive. But I found on the New Japan site some more they were selling, and the one that I got from there is Naito, and this one looks good. Again, I just the detail on these are really cool. I wish they put more of them out. And the figures, when I looked up, I was curious what the dimensions are. It didn't really say on the box to give you a better idea of these. And it listed online as 13.5 centimeters where they were selling these. If I translate that in the terms we usually use for English, it's 5.31 inches. I know they've done a few of different Noah figures. I don't have any of them yet. They had a couple of Muda that I saw, like a retirement figure and I think a vintage figure. And I've seen other ones. I actually saw one of Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody, I think a year ago, that was on pre-order, but I did not get those either. And the one of my favorite of all these probably, and this is another one, is probably one of my favorite figures period, is this one of Okada. It was very, very hard to find. It's just a very cool looking figure. The facial detail on him, it's just different, very different. Storm Collectibles is a company that puts out wrestling figures occasionally, usually through a third party. And the one that I got from there first was Jushin Liger, and I have two different figures of Jushin Liger. One is supposed to represent what he looked like at the very beginning of his career. He's got more of red gear on, and the face mask is a little different. The other one, he's wearing more purple gear, and it looks more like I remember him when he was in WCW. And then they came out with a figure of Minoru Suzuki, and I would have to say, as far as overall the way this figure looks, the facial detail, the appearance, this may be my favorite figure in my collection. It is just such a cool looking collectible. You have to go and look this one up online to see what I'm talking about. I believe you can still find it for sale. And he's wearing black tights. It's not the elaborate gear, it's just the detail of the way the figure looks. So those are the different Japanese wrestling figures I have. I'm always looking for more. Being in the US, they're hard to find. But if you go online and dig around, you can certainly find them being sold through third parties. And if you dig around and are patient, you can find reasonable deals to obtain some of these different figures. The vintage print wrestling material I want to talk about this episode is another wrestling program. This is from Pro Wrestling USA, from Star Wars 85 card at the Meadowlands. A little bit about Pro Wrestling USA. Pro Wrestling USA is almost, I feel like, one of those forgotten things in wrestling history, but very interesting and significant in the mid-80s. So let's go back to 1985. The pro wrestling promotions' regional territories was heading to a rapid end at that time, whether people realized it or not. I mean, the 60s and 70s and the early 80s, that was the structure of wrestling in the U.S., these regional territories. But WWF, beginning probably around 83, they began this aggressive expansion into a national promotion and an international product, both syndicated and cable TV program. And this all coincided with these regional promotions losing their top talent to WWF. The WWF began running shows in the same areas as these regional promotions. They were airing program locally in competition as well. And the regional promotions, kind of in a macro look at this, they saw business fall off, and they were seemingly going out of business. They were just disappearing. And so, by the mid-80s, WWF's competitors in the national scene were the NWA, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, airing in syndication on cable, run by Jim Crockett Jr., mostly running shows in the southern U.S., but they had an eye on expanding further north in the eastern U.S., spreading out all over the country. And also there was the AWA, and they were based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, run by Vern Gagne, and they were holding shows primarily in the Midwest. And AWA aired on ESPN at the time 5 days a week. But the WWF was growing in popularity. There was a lot of mainstream attention they were getting. And to combat the WWF's rapid expansion, the AWA, they formed an alliance with the NWA and several of the surviving regional promotions. And their goal was to run joint shows. And so they ran a star-studded show where they drew like 21,000 people to Kaminsky Park in Chicago on September 21st, 1985. And this card was called Super Clash, and it featured Ric Flair versus Magnum TA for the NWA World Heavyweight title, Rick Martel versus Stan Hansen for the AWA World Heavyweight title, So the concept of this was really cool, and it seemed like it had a lot of promise. And they called it the Alliance Pro Wrestling USA, but it didn't last long at all. Within a year, it was done. From what I've read about it and researched it, the different promoters couldn't get along. They wanted their guys going over, and there was a lot of dissension. And it didn't last long, and it was over within a year. Now I didn't attend this show, this Star Wars '85, but I went probably in the early '90s and bought a lot of mint condition programs. There was a gentleman that had actually made programs and published them and written the content for a lot of different promotions, and he was selling them mail order, and I bought a ton of these, and they're really cool to have. But I'm going to go through the program, give you an idea of what was on this in this here and what was going on that night. On the cover, we have Ric Flair with his NWA title. We also have a picture of Paul Ellering and the Road Warriors, a picture of Sergeant Slaughter, and a picture of Rick Martel, and then there's a logo for AWA and a logo for the NWA. And the front cover here, it just says, "Welcome to Star Wars '85, Pro Wrestling USA at the Meadowlands, the top stars and champions of the American Wrestling Association and the National Wrestling Alliance on the greatest card ever." So when I flip inside, the first page says, "Welcome to Star Wars '85, Pro Wrestling USA at the Meadowlands, the top stars and champions of the American Wrestling Association and the National Wrestling Alliance on the greatest card ever." It says the Road Warriors defend the AWA World Tag Team Championship against the team of Jerry Lawler and Tommy Rich. And then it mentions that there's going to be another card returning to the Meadowlands on April 19th, 1985. Although it doesn't here at the beginning say what date this card took place. So next page talks about Rick Martel defends AWA World's Heavyweight title against gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. It talks about a Pro Wrestling USA show on TV and gives the local channel. It says Saturday mornings at 11. The next match they're talking about on the next page, Ric Flair defends NWA World Heavyweight title against Harley Race. It talks about the High Flyers on Star Wars '85, and it's got a picture of Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell. And I think shortly after this is when Jim Brunzell left to go to WWF and form the Killer Bees with Brian Blair. It doesn't mention who they're wrestling. All right, and then we get to the next page, and we have the official lineup. So I'll just go through the rest of the card from top to bottom. The opening match, Ugandan Giant Kamala, and they're spelling it Kimala, which was his spelling before he was in WWF, versus opponent to be named. Special event, Bob Backlund versus Billy Robinson. 6-man tag team match, Jay Youngblood and Mark Youngblood and Jimmy Valiant versus Larry Zbyszko and Terry Funk and Nick Bockwinkel. Special tag team feature, the High Flyers, Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell versus the Masked Superstar and Mr. Saito. NWA World Tag Team Championship, Ivan and Nikita Koloff, the champions, versus the Fabulous Ones, Stan Lane and Steve Kern. We have the AWA Tag Team title match that I mentioned just before. Then they have that AWA title match with Garvin and Martel. And then at the top of the card, they are listing the very top matches. Again, is Flair and Harley Race. So that was the official lineup. Then it's just some more pictures in here. They got a picture of Mr. Saito, even though he's not on the card. A picture of Sergeant Slaughter. Jerry Blackwell, who I remember from AWA. They got a picture of the Fabulous Ones. They got like a one-page, couple paragraph article on Bob Backlund facing Billy Robinson. And then the last 2 pages are something they call Names in the News. It's just pictures of different people with captions. We have Ivan and Nikita Koloff. We have Kamala, Jay and Mark Youngblood, Sergeant Slaughter, Terry Funk, and the Masked Superstar, which was Demolition Axe, shortly after this. And then on the back cover, there's just like little kind of yearbook-sized pictures of different people. Jerry Lawler, Bob Backlund, Baron Von Raschke, Kamala, Sheik Adnan, Nick Bockwinkel, Tommy Rich, Larry Zbyszko, and Terry Funk. So there you go. The program from the Pro Wrestling USA Star Wars '85 from the Meadowlands from February 24th, 1985. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the free The Pro Wrestling Exuberant email newsletter, where I write about wrestling topics from the past and present and share personal stories from my time as a wrestling referee and magazine writer in the 90s by going to substack.com / at the Pro Wrestling Exuberant.